Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Steve Balmer, 1956 to 2000. And let me start with a quote. I didn't pull you out of Stanford Business School to bankrupt the company. So that's from Bill Gates early on in their business career, arguing with the man he just hired as Microsoft's first ever business manager. And that man, of course, was Steve Ballmer. And the two of them would go on to build one of obviously the most valuable companies in history together, but through huge arguments, a legendary contract with IBM, and a decade of really ruthless sales tactics that got Windows onto practically every computer on the planet, or at least 90% of them. And this episode takes Balmer from his childhood right up to becoming Microsoft's CEO in 2000. It's a cracker. Enjoy. So Steve Balmer, born Detroit, March 24th, 1956, and his father Fritz was a Swiss immigrant, and he was fluent in 6 languages. So as a result, he got work as a translator at the first Nuremberg trial, and this then landed him a mid-level management job at Ford in Detroit, and his mother Beatrice was a housewife. Balmer was described initially as a shy, anxious kid, but he obviously comes out of his shell, and he also excels at maths. He graduates valedictorian in 1973 with a perfect 800 on the math SAT, and then he plays football, manages the basketball team. He becomes very outgoing. Classmates, they describe him as intense, but this almost overwhelming force who never seems to run out of energy. And any of one of you who have watched Balmer will know of this energy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, I mean, you are in for a treat, because what I really recommend is that you pause this podcast for a minute if you can, go onto YouTube and type in Steve Balmer going crazy on stage. It is hilarious stuff. It is just so funny. Now, Balmer has said of his energy, and this is a quote from him, I personally feed off energy, and it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's me. Personally, I find Balmer's energy kind of weird, kind of overwhelming, definitely, and it's not for me. So I can't really explain why I love it. I mean, maybe it's because when I showed the videos of Balmer going nuts to my kids, they got such a laugh out of it. But I think why I like it is because I think it's authentic. I mean, sometimes it might not look to be authentic, but having read and seen so much of Balmer, I believe it really is who he is. It's always how he's been, this intense energy. Now, Balmer starts Harvard in 1973, majoring in applied maths and economics. And in typical Balmer fashion, he throws himself into everything, joining every club that he can. And he also forms a friendship with a certain Bill Gates, who lives down the hall from Balmer, and they also go to the same economics class. And while they're opposites, Balmer is gregarious, he's outgoing, Gates is much more insular, they do share the same intensity. Classmates recall the two of them arguing furiously over economic theory, and they also had this very distinct and unusual habit of rocking back and forth in their chairs while they were studying and concentrating. And while Gates is so smart, when it comes to maths, Balmer is way better than him. And it's a result of Balmer's brilliance in maths that Gates realises he was never going to be a world-class mathematician, and that nudges him further towards computers. Now, Gates' friend, Paul Allen, who's also from Seattle, same as Gates, he at this time is working at Honeywell, also based in Boston, and he and Gates have a company at that time, while Gates is in Harvard, called Trafodata. It's analysing automobile traffic data. And Balmer was very, very impressed that this geeky young kid already had a company. Then, in December 1974, Popular Electronics magazine put the Altair 8800 on the cover. And I think it's 8800. It might be 8800. I'm not a techie, I don't know. But this was the world's first commercially successful microcomputer. Alan buys the magazines and he hurries to Gates' dorm room and he says, it's happening without us. A month later, in January 1975, Gates dropped out of college and he and Alan founded Microsoft. But Balmer stays at Harvard. He finishes his degree, he graduates magna cum laude in 1977, joins Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati as an assistant product manager in the food division. So he's looking after the marketing for brownie and cake mix and making around $20,000 a year. Now, interestingly, he shares this cubicle with another young hire named Jeffrey Immelt, who'll go on to become the CEO of General Electric, succeeding, of course, the legendary Jack Welch, who we covered in an episode. Now, it didn't turn out too well for Immelt. GE more or less crashed during his reign, but that's another story, and I will cover it. Anyway, Balmer, he talks fondly of his time at P&G, but it's pretty clear that his talents are being wasted. Like, here's a guy with boundless energy and ambition. He's got a Harvard degree in applied maths and economics, and he's trying to come up with new ways of selling more cake mix. And at the same time, he's watching Microsoft grow. By 1978, 3 years after its foundation, Microsoft had 13 employees, $1 million in annual revenue. I mean, yeah, not huge money, but it's growing year on year. What Microsoft was doing at the time, it was licensing custom versions of BASIC, one of the first ever programming languages, to companies like Apple and Commodore. Then in spring 1979, Balmer, he leaves P&G after being accepted into Stanford's Graduate School of Business to do an MBA. And at Stanford, Balmer, he stands out immediately because this is the late 70s and the Californian vibe at that time is shorts and sandals, but Balmer is wearing pressed trousers and a crisp white button-down shirt. And this is one of the things I've always liked about Balmer. He doesn't mind standing out in a way that might make him look prudish or even an idiot, because, yeah, he's a bit weird, he's a bit different, but so what? Anyway, classmates at Stanford also noted that he was hyper ambitious, and just as he did at Harvard, he kind of impresses and exhausts everyone around him. He dominates socially and academically. He's the top student in his class. But he's still keeping in touch with Gates at Microsoft, and Microsoft is still growing. By the end of 1979, the company has 25 employees, 2.5 million in revenue. So revenue has climbed 2.5 times in 1 year. So again, while the money isn't huge, the trajectory, it's impressive. So in 1980, Balmer takes a summer job with Microsoft. Now, up to this point, Microsoft is almost all engineers, and Gates knows that if the company is going to scale, he needs a different type of person. And for Gates, Balmer is that type of person. So on June 11th, 1980, Balmer officially joins Microsoft as its first business manager. He's the 30th employee. And he negotiates a starting salary of $50,000 a year, but crucially, he also negotiates a bonus worth 10% of any increase in the company's profits that he helps generate. But to Balmer's parents, to his classmates, to his professors, like, this decision, it seems crazy. He is one of the best students at Stanford Business School. He's on course for a safe, very, very financially well-rewarding career in finance, and he's walking away to join a tiny, unknown software company run by a 24-year-old Bill Gates and his co-founder Paul Allen. With his long hair and beard, he looked more like a hippie. So it was a big risk. Now, Gates obviously thinks very highly of Balmer, but what about Paul Allen? Well, here's a quote from Allen's 2011 book, Idea Man. "I thought, this guy looks like an operative for the NKVD, the secret police of the USSR. He had piercing blue eyes and a genuine toughness." And you see, Balmer is tough. Almost immediately after being hired, he and Gates had their first fight. And by the way, the Gates-Balmer relationship, it was known for their closeness, at least for the first 20 years or so anyway, but also for their massive arguments. So, as Balmer saw it, programmers in Microsoft were being pulled every which way. They were writing code, they were writing instruction manuals, they were answering customer service lines, they were managing technical relations with corporate clients. So Balmer wanted to hire product managers, administrative staff. He wanted to professionalize the business so that the programmers could focus purely on software. But Gates was always so conservative about finances. He famously insisted on keeping enough cash in the bank to keep Microsoft running for a full year on zero revenue. So when Balmer insisted they needed new hires, Gates fired back with this line that they've both told many times since and that I also quoted at the top of this episode. He said, "I didn't pull you out of Stanford Business School to bankrupt the company." But Balmer doesn't give up, and Gates relents. And Balmer was right about the need to hire and professionalise the company, because just a few months after joining Microsoft comes the IBM deal. Probably one of the most well-known and seismic deals in the history of software. So, for context, by this stage, Microsoft had built a very solid reputation in programming languages, especially BASIC. IBM, who by this stage was the undisputed giant of computing at that time, it was secretly building its first personal computer to compete with Apple, and they needed software, including BASIC. So they called a meeting with Microsoft, and Gates, he famously turned to Balmer and said, "Steve, you better come to the meeting. You're the only other guy who can wear a suit." Now, during the meeting, IBM explained that they needed an operating system. That's the core software that allows a computer to start up and run programs. But Microsoft didn't make operating systems at the time, so Gates pointed IBM to Gary Kildall, who owned Digital Research, and their operating system, CP/M, was the industry standard. Now, when IBM's executives arrived at Digital Research, Kildall was away on business. His wife and business partner, Dorothy, she was kind of reluctant to sign IBM's non-disclosure agreement without any legal advice. And in fairness, by all accounts, the NDA that IBM presented her with was really, really one-sided. So IBM went back to Gates and they said, "We can't deal with those guys. Can you just provide us with an operating system?" So Microsoft paid a local Seattle company $75,000 to own the rights to a CP/M clone that they had developed called QDOS. That was short for Quick and Dirty Operating System, and Microsoft renamed it MS-DOS. So IBM then agreed to pay Microsoft a flat fee of $430,000. But the key part to all of this, the little nugget, the Trojan horse that lays the foundation to Microsoft's huge success, is that Gates insisted on a strictly non-exclusive contract. So in other words, IBM gets to use the operating system for a flat fee, but Microsoft keeps total ownership of the operating system. They can sell it to anyone else. IBM, you see, mistakenly believed that the real money was in the hardware, not the operating system. And that mistake would prove to be worth tens of billions of dollars to Microsoft. And here's a quote from Balmer on that deal, from an interview he did on the Acquired podcast. He said, "Luck is important in the creation of great companies. It is. A lot of people will say we're masters of the universe. We figure everything out. We never have any luck because we're so talented." Sure, they're talented people and hardworking people, but most people have a little luck in their story, and this was our big luck. So, now Balmer's primary objective is getting their operating system onto as many machines as possible, and he does this by getting deals with what's called OEMs. That's short for Original Equipment Manufacturers. In other words, the computer manufacturers. And the breakthrough comes from Compaq. They were founded in 1982, and Compaq builds the first real IBM-compatible clone, and Balmer sells them the exact same operating system IBM was using. And that one deal, it basically legitimizes the whole clone market. And suddenly, IBM are faced with huge competition from dozens and dozens of OEMs or computer manufacturers, and all of them are happy to use the exact same software as IBM, and within a few years, Balmer has done licensing deals with more than 70 OEMs. And this is where Balmer's commercial aggression and his strategic brilliance, it really comes to the fore, because he became the driving force behind what became infamously known as per processor licensing. So here's how it worked. This is very good. Instead of paying Microsoft only for the computers that shipped with MS-DOS, Microsoft's operating system, Balmer offered manufacturers a much lower price if they agreed to pay Microsoft for every PC they built, whether it ran MS-DOS or not. Now, for the manufacturers, this was a fantastic deal because IBM had already made MS-DOS the industry standard, so almost every customer wanted it anyway, and paying a lower fee on every machine saved them millions. But Balmer's deal had laid a trap, because if a manufacturer later wanted to offer a rival operating system, it still had to pay Microsoft under the contract they'd agreed with them, and then pay the rival as well. In effect, it would have had to pay twice. So faced with that choice, most manufacturers simply stuck with Microsoft, making it really, really difficult for competing operating systems to gain any foothold. Revenue in Microsoft jumped from 8 million in 1980 to 24 million by 1982 to 55 million by 1983. But this success throws up a problem, because remember, as part of his original deal, Balmer gets 10% of profits, and this is a huge cash drain on the company and a sticking point when Microsoft raises outside investment. So, for a bit of context, before Microsoft got any investment, Gates has 64% equity, Allen has 36%. I always ask myself, why wasn't it 50-50? Well, initially it was 60-40 to Gates, because when they first set up, Gates was dropping out of college, taking a huge risk, whereas Allen was still working and had a salary. So Gates thought, I'm more deserving of more equity. Fair enough. Then, not long after they agreed the 60-40 split, Gates came back to the negotiating table again, and he told Allen that after looking at the sheer volume of work he was doing, he deserved an even larger piece of the pie, and so they agreed to a 64-36 split. Now, as they're growing, Microsoft, they didn't need any money, but they did want an investor, an experienced Silicon Valley venture capital firm to join their board of directors for, I suppose, what you'd call adult advice, and also they had a long-term plan to go public. So in the early 80s, VC firm TVI put $1 million into the company for a 5% stake. That valued Microsoft at $20 million. Now, it should be known, by the time flotation comes around, which I'll talk about, that $1 million was worth $48 million. But TVI stayed on Microsoft's board up until 2014. That's 33 years, so it's likely that they held on to the stock for a good while, so it would have been worth billions and billions of dollars. Anyway, back to Balmer's 10% profit share. Before TVI invested, they proposed that Balmer scrap the 10% profit share in return for 8% of the company. But Paul Allen wasn't happy. In his memoir, Idea Man, he explained that Balmer had only been at Microsoft a short time, and he didn't believe he'd earned 8% of the company because the company's value was exploding. So Allen refused to give up any of his own shares to make this happen. But to save the VC deal and to protect his relationship with Balmer, Gates agreed to fund the majority of Balmer's 8% out of his own personal equity. Now, just reflect on this for a moment. I mean, given how hard Gates had negotiated with Allen over that extra 4%, and also given how tough a negotiator Gates is known to be, I think it's testament to how highly he regarded Balmer that he gave him 8% of his own equity to keep him on board. Anyway, by 1982, the relationship between Allen and Gates and Balmer had become, I suppose, increasingly strained, because at this time, Allen was being treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma. And on one occasion, as he passed Gates' office, he overhears Gates and Balmer talking about him. Specifically, they're discussing how to dilute Allen's equity by issuing themselves large blocks of new stock options. Allen walks into the office and he's furious. "This is unbelievable," he says. "It shows your true character once and for all." Now, both Gates and Balmer, they do personally apologise and call the plan unfair. And I think most founders can probably relate to this kind of issue happening. I mean, tensions over who's pulling more weight, they always happen. They're an inevitable part of building something ambitious. And when the pressure is on, it's easy to forget the people building it, I suppose, are human too and might be having other issues, as Allen was at that time. Anyway, 2 months later, in February 1983, Allen resigns, but he stays on the board and he holds on to his equity. And with Allen gone, Balmer becomes Gates' closest and, I suppose, most trusted partner. Then, in 1984, as president of System Software, Balmer is given direct control over the Windows project. Now, I'd always thought that Windows was their big project, the product they were betting the farm on. But initially, it wasn't. Apple had just launched the Macintosh and it had this new graphical interface of windows, icons, and a mouse. And so Microsoft began building its own graphical operating environment called Windows. At first, though, it was little more than an insurance policy because MS DOS was still making all the money. And no one at Microsoft knew whether graphical interfaces would become the future or just another passing trend. Microsoft's real bet on the future was a totally different operating system they were building with IBM called OS2. And Windows was really just meant to hold the line until that came along, which is partly why the Windows project had been drifting for years and had picked up a reputation internally as the assignment that nobody wanted. So when Balmer took it over, it was already 2 years late, it was branded vaporware in the trade press, and it had huge design issues. And Balmer's approach wasn't to fix the design, it was to get it shipped. That's all that mattered. He famously called an all-hands meeting at 9 a.m. on Easter Sunday morning just to make that point. Now, in terms of his style, well, we already know from those videos of Balmer that I recommend you watch that he has this kind of manic energy. And working under him was described by one programmer as being like a Marine boot camp, a fraternity party, and a trip to the zoo all at once. And I love this. Another employee whose office was located directly across the hall from Balmer, he said that a meeting with Balmer would typically begin with Balmer speaking in low conversational tones. Within minutes, Balmer would begin to pace the room, his voice rising dramatically as he grew more animated, gesturing forcefully and shouting to drive home his points. And as the meeting reached its peak, his voice would boom through the corridor. Yet, the moment the meeting ended, the door would open and Balmer would bid a friendly, calm farewell to whomever was in the meeting, who by now would be looking totally exhausted and frazzled, and then Balmer would calmly invite the next person in with his standard high-spirited enthusiasm. I just love that. But the thing is, with Balmer, is he got results. Yes, okay, he made some really bad tech predictions and business decisions when he became CEO, and I'll get into that when I do the second episode on Balmer, but he also gets results. And in this case, he got Windows shipped on time, November 20th, 1985. It was clunky, it was compromised, it wasn't really any good, but he got it out and it was a start. Revenue in Microsoft went from 140 million in 1985 to 198 million in 1986, and this is the year that Microsoft went public. The stock closed its first day valuing the company at 777 million, so Gates' 45% stake is worth around 350 million, Balmer's 8% is worth 62 million. Now Windows, the first version, had flopped commercially, no surprise there, but they kept developing it. Partly, as I said, as insurance in case IBM's OS2 failed, and partly because Gates now believed that graphical computing was the future, and if Microsoft built both the operating system and the applications like Word, like Excel, it could control the next generation of personal computing. And in December 1987, Windows 2 arrived and it was a significant improvement. It was good enough that Apple sued Microsoft claiming that Windows copied Macintosh's look and feel, which is pretty hypocritical really, given that Steve Jobs had more or less copied Apple's own graphical interface ideas from Xerox. Anyway, more importantly, Microsoft now had a platform for its own software. Excel was built for Windows from the outset, and Word soon followed. And while rivals like Lotus and WordPerfect were slow to embrace graphical computing, Microsoft wasn't. By the time Lotus and WordPerfect realized Windows was the future, Microsoft already had the operating system and the applications people wanted to run on it. But then came what Balmer would later call the divorce. It happened in September 1990 when Balmer picked up the Wall Street Journal one morning and read that IBM was cutting its ties with Microsoft. IBM wasn't happy that Microsoft was continuing with Windows, and so they decided to build their own operating system on their own. So that posed a huge, existential threat for Microsoft, because selling Windows through PC manufacturers, the OEMs, that only reached new computers, but large corporations could wipe those machines and install whichever operating system their CIO or CTO approved. Now, up to this point, most large businesses used Microsoft, but it was IBM who had the relationship and the trust of those CIOs stroke CTOs. So once IBM's operating system was ready, IBM could potentially dominate all large businesses. If Microsoft didn't build its own enterprise sales force and quickly, IBM could shut Windows out of the corporate world. So Balmer took on the challenge, and he was determined to stop IBM from, as he later put it, squishing us like a bug. And he succeeds. Over the next decade, Balmer built Microsoft's enterprise division into the most dominant corporate sales machine in business history. In May 1990, you have Windows 3 is launched, followed a few months later by Microsoft Office for Windows with Word, Excel and PowerPoint bundled together. This is a huge moment, not just for Microsoft, but for computer users everywhere. And that same year, Microsoft became the first PC software company in the world to cross $1 billion in annual sales. That year also, Balmer marries Connie, and by all accounts, they've been happily married ever since and have 3 sons, so a very stable family life. But Balmer's physically aggressive style catches up with him. This is in 1991. He's at a regional sales meeting in Japan where he's shouting Windows, Windows, Windows over and over again to fire up local distributors. And again, if you have the time, why don't you Google Steve Balmer developers, and you'll see what he's like. And anyway, during this meeting, he damages his vocal cords badly enough that he needs throat surgery. And after that surgery, he began placing a plastic Honey Bear squeeze bottle on the whiteboard eraser shelf before presentations. And he'd shout passionately for several minutes, pause to drink the raw honey straight from the bottle, and then immediately get back to shouting again. And then comes 1995, and of course, Windows 95. Arguably the biggest software launch the industry had ever seen up to that point. You got to understand the scale of it. Like, people lined up at midnight outside stores to buy this. The Empire State Building gets lit up in Microsoft colours. And Microsoft pays $3 million to license the Rolling Stones song Start Me Up for the ad campaign. And again, I know I'm driving you to YouTube all the time, but I really, really recommend you go to YouTube after this episode and type in Windows 95 launch dance. It is probably the funniest, most cringy thing you will ever see. You have Bill Gates and a few other programmers trying to dance on stage. They are just so awkward. At the same time, you have Balmer doing his usual high energy, fist bumping, jumping and jiggling. It's brilliant. Even just thinking about it makes me laugh. Anyway, Windows 95 is a juggernaut of a success. And by 1999, the company's revenues are just under 20 billion. Windows is on about 90% of computers globally, and the company's market cap is close on $500 billion. That's the highest valuation any company on earth had ever reached. But the aggression this success was built on, it had been coming home to roost for a few years. Remember Balmer's pre-processor licensing deal where manufacturers paid Microsoft for every computer shipped, even ones without Microsoft software? Well, in 1984, the Department of Justice filed a complaint targeting it, and under pressure, Microsoft abandoned the practice. But then in 1998 comes the biggest existential threat yet. The Justice Department accuses Microsoft of illegally maintaining its monopoly by bundling Internet Explorer with Windows with a view to killing off Netscape. And that's a whole story on its own, and I will cover it. But Gates's video deposition for this case, it is a unmitigated disaster. He comes across as evasive, churlish, defensive, and it really damages Microsoft defense. Now, there's a lot of other elements that lead to Microsoft's defense being very damaged, but that was one of it. Balmer also, by contrast, he'd always pushed privately for a pragmatic settlement. As he said, Being the object of a lawsuit or a complaint from your government is a very awkward, uncomfortable position to be in. It just has all downside. And he was right. So, despite all of its success, by the end of the century, Microsoft is facing a lot of problems. I mean, keeping a $600 billion company growing at 20 or 30% a year, it's becoming very difficult. And remember, we're in 1999. This is the height of the internet boom. Compared to all these new startups, Microsoft is now seen as this huge corporate entity. It's not as exciting as it once was. So you have top engineers leaving to join these flashier startups, and most of the top engineers coming out of college, they're not flocking to Microsoft like they would have just 5 years previously. Also, the government's antitrust case is continuing. Gates is exhausted, he's publicly vilified, and he's seen as a PR liability. So Microsoft needed a reset with the public, with the press, the government, the court, with employees, with potential employees. So on January 13th, 2000, Balmer was officially named CEO, with Gates moving himself into this newly invented role called Chief Software Architect. The reaction to Balmer's elevation, it's mixed. The trade press, they question whether a company built by programmers, for programmers, can survive being run by Balmer, who has no programming background at all. Inside Microsoft, it's definitely a culture shift. Gates was this intimidating genius nerd. Balmer is boisterous, energetic, driven. He's pushy, yes, but overall he's a far nicer boss than Gates. So how does it turn out? Well, that's where we'll leave it for today. It's really nicely poised for the second part in maybe 6 months or a year's time, where I'll look at Balmer's time as the CEO. So I'm going to kind of reserve overall judgment on him until then. But I gotta say, based on what I've learned about Balmer from this part of his life, I like him. I mean, yeah, he's strange. He's way too energetic. He gets way overexcited. But he always comes across as a genuinely pretty decent guy. And also from a business side, he gets results. He delivers on a huge scale. Overall, I just think he makes for a great business story. And that brings us to listeners' emails. And this one comes from Dylan, who'd love to hear an episode on Volkswagen. A fantastic suggestion, Dylan. And I think Volkswagen warrants a 2 or maybe an even 3-parter. There's so much to it. Thanks so much for the suggestion, Dylan, and for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.